Hello and welcome to Spirit of Truth Church. For this talk on biblical manhood and womanhood, what does it mean to not teach or have authority over men? So this is one of the really big questions in Christianity in terms of roles for women in the church and what are women allowed to do and what are they not allowed to do. So I'd like to go ahead and start simply by reading 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 15. All right. 1 Timothy 2, 11 through 15. A woman should learn in silence with full submission. I do not allow a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. Instead, she is to be silent. For Adam was created first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and transgressed. But she will be saved through childbearing, if she continues in faith, love, and holiness with good judgment. So yeah, definitely tough verses, especially in the modern day context. So let's go ahead and dive in and see what's actually going on here. So first, Paul, arguing in 1 Corinthians 12, 7 through 11, is arguing that Christian women, like men, have been given spiritual gifts. So we have to recognize right off the bat, we can't overinterpret this verse and simply say that women have no place of anything of any kind in any form of ministry or church. If they've been given spiritual gifts, then it's very clear that those have been to edify the church and to build up the body of believers. Okay? And women, like men, are to use these gifts to minister to the body of Christ, as in 1 Peter 4:10. So let's go ahead and read those two now. 1 Corinthians 12, 7 through 11. A demonstration of the Spirit is given to each person to produce what is beneficial. To one, a message of wisdom through the Spirit. To another, a message of knowledge by the same Spirit. To another, faith by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another, the performing of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, distinguishing of spirits. To another, distinguishing or different kinds of languages. To another, interpretation of languages. But one and the same Spirit is active in all these, distributing to each person as he wills. Okay, so here we have it again, both men and women without differentiation. And we also have 1 Peter 4:10. Based on the gift each one has received, use it to serve others as good managers of the varied grace of God. So again, these are incorporating both men and women in these verses. And so right off the bat, we see that yes, indeed, women are going to have spiritual gifts, and they need to be able to use them to build up and edify the church. So with that, ministries are again indispensable to life and growth of the church. For that, you can take a look at 1 Corinthians 12 through 26. Massive discussion on that. However, are there restrictions on women? And so to do that, we have to go, for example, to 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. And it does seem there are restrictions on women that these verses place. So again, 1 Timothy 2, 8 through 15. And which we already read, but I'll just read the first part. Therefore, I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or argument. Also, the women are to dress themselves in modest clothing with decency and good sense, not with elaborate hairstyles, gold, pearls, or expensive apparel, but with good works, as is proper for women who affirm that they worship God. And then it goes on to what we read earlier. So, yes, there are restrictions, honestly, on both men and women in certain situations, as we see here. So we do have those. And what this verse seems to say, at first glance, is that women are not to teach or have authority over men. And the reason given from Paul is because of the order in which God created man and woman, and because of how man and woman fell into sin. Now, the problem is that many people think that this does not require the contemporary church to limit the ministry of women, and others, again, think it limits it only in certain circumstances, that it's not a general limitation. And unfortunately, non-evangelical New Testament scholars generally believe that all three pastoral epistles were not written by Paul and thus have no authority. So you're getting this attacked from multiple angles. You're getting this attacked from the authority of Scripture, saying, yeah, well, Paul didn't write those three epistles. You're getting this attacked from the idea of, yeah, it's not really relevant for now. You're getting this attacked from a slew of different angles. Everybody's trying to get rid of these verses and thus inflict massive change upon the church as a whole. Now, there are two positions we're going to argue for in this talk. First, that women are not to teach Christian doctrine to men. The second is they are not to exercise authority directly over men in the church either. And so to begin to unpack this, we have to go to the setting of this letter to Timothy. So this is the first letter to his disciple, Paul's disciple, and co-worker Timothy. And the purpose of the letter was to remind him how people ought to conduct themselves in God's household, which is the church of the living God. Again, we'll take a look. This is 1 Timothy 3:15. But if I should be delayed, I have written so that you will know how people ought to act in God's household, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and foundation of truth. So this is the reason why he's writing here. Ephesus, we know, is overrun by false teaching. So we can take a look at verses 1-3, which says, "As I urged you when I went to Macedonia, remain in Ephesus so that you may instruct certain people not to teach different doctrine." So we know false doctrine is a serious issue. We know that that's a big problem here. And the people have departed from the true teaching of the gospel. They've become quarrelsome, argumentative. They're propagating doctrines that are erroneous. It's causing serious problems. And so the false teaching being addressed in 1 Timothy 2:11-15 can't be ascertained from the text. We don't know exactly what the false teaching was. Many scholars try, but it shouldn't play a large role in our exegesis. We have to make sure that we're taking a cautious approach. We know that there's false doctrine going on. We know that these issues with men and women are sort of in some way linked to it, but we don't necessarily know exactly what the false doctrine was that was resulting in this activity. But we can have some ideas. We just have to take a cautious approach. So what are the relevant ideas? Well, we know that false teachers sowed dissension and were occupied with or preoccupied with trivialities, things that really didn't matter. We know that false teachers stressed asceticism as a means of spirituality, and they were teaching the abstinence from foods and from marriage and sex in general were ways of getting in closer communion with God. And unfortunately, we also know that false teachers persuaded many women to follow them in their doctrines. And as a result, they were encouraging women to discard what we might call traditional feminine roles in favor of an egalitarian approach to the role of relationships of men and women. And so again, what is one of these? The encouragement to abstain from marriage. Okay, this was very likely to include a more general denigration of traditional female roles as well. There was counsel to the young widows. Okay, was to marry, have children, and to manage their homes. And it's because some have turned away to follow Satan. So again, we can see even in these, like there's this attack on marriage, this attack on traditional roles, this attack on family that's coming from false teachers, and it's a satanic issue. And that's, again, that's what's going on here. They've turned away to follow Satan. There's a satanic issue going on here. And so the false teaching sounds similar to the general problem that lurks also, by the way, behind 1 Corinthians, which is there's a problem arising within the church involving a denial of the future physical resurrection in favor of a present spiritual resurrection. And this led to incorrect attitudes about sex, marriage, food, and a tendency on the part of women to disregard appropriate roles. And so again, there's a decent enough reason to believe that the problem in both situations was rooted in a false belief that Christians were already in the full form of God's kingdom and that they had accordingly been spiritually taken out of the world so that aspects of creation were no longer relevant. And I'm going to pause here because this is reoccurring today. I firmly believe that when we teach that God's kingdom is here right now in the church age, we are going to run into heresy issues of all kinds, including the kinds that they're seeing here in Paul's letters. Because once we essentially say that the kingdom is here, I believe that is not a correct doctrine. I think the kingdom was postponed. And once we start saying it's here, we're going to start assuming things that are true in the Messianic kingdom of this current age. And that's going to lead to issues. So it's just interesting that they were dealing with this idea of the kingdom now, even back then, and Paul was refuting it. Now, what is appropriate behavior for Christian women? So let's take a look more closely at verses 5-11. So this is going to be 1 Timothy 2, 5-11. For there is one God and one mediator between God and humanity, Jesus Christ, himself human, who gave himself a ransom for all, a testimony at the proper time. For this I was appointed a herald, an apostle, I am telling the truth, I am not lying, and a teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth. Therefore, I want the men in every place to pray, lifting up their holy hands without anger or argument. Also, the women are to dress themselves in modest clothing, with decency and good sense, not with elaborate hairstyles, gold, pearls, or expensive apparel, but with good works, as is proper for women who affirm that they worship God. A woman should learn in silence with full submission. So, again, there's instructions to men. Men ever would lift up holy hands, no anger, no disputations. This is everywhere or in every place. This is wherever they go. Okay, and whatever church they're in. This is just how people are to conduct themselves. Likewise, this is connected with the Christian women issues. So let's take a look. The women were to dress modestly. The words pray and adorn are both infinitives. It's natural to think that they both depend on the verb want. In context at the end of verse 8, and Paul's focus is shifted to appropriate behavior, and he doesn't come back to the topic of prayer. So we see here, even in the teaching of women in these verses, they're to dress themselves, not elaborate, and dress themselves in good works, and then learn in silence and full submission. So we're seeing these limitations. Now, divisiveness and discord is again a result of false teaching, which is why Paul is arguing against this exact topic. And the problem in 1 Corinthians 11:2-16 was that Christian women were adopting a style of dress that implicitly proclaimed their independence from their husbands. And so the exhortation then in Timothy is to adorn with good deeds. Okay? But by the time we get to verse 11, Paul's moved into activities that don't fall in this category, that aren't in the dressed category. They are learning quietness and full submission. So how are women to learn according to this verse? Well, hesukia can mean silence or quietness in a sense of peaceableness. But there's a good reason, again, to think that the word should be translated silence, given that its opposite is teaching. So in other words, teaching would be a vocal activity. Silence would be not teaching. Okay? So it makes sense to translate silence as opposed to just peaceableness. And women should accept the teaching of the church peaceably, without criticism and without dispute. And Paul is encouraging the women to be wise learners. Women had picked up this disputatious habits of false teachers, and Paul's warning them to accept without criticism the teaching of the properly appointed church leaders, the apostolic teaching, the apostles. And so the issue here we can actually see is both submission of women to the church and submission of women to the husbands. So women were expressing their liberation from their husbands or from other men in the church by criticizing and speaking out against male leaders. So it's actually a both-and situation. And Paul is encouraging Timothy to counter this by enforcing the principle of submission of the women to appropriate male leadership. Now, Paul was only prohibiting women from teaching men. And this is also a secondary point that's important. Women could teach other women, women could teach children. The issue was other men, because that would again be a role inversal and an inversal of the created order. So let's dive into verse 12. The prohibitions of ministry of women. So the term full submission is the hinge between women learning in quietness and not permitting a woman to teach or have authority over a man. And the word that connects these is de, and it has a mild adversative force. But again, the transition is from one activity that women are to carry out in submission to two others that are prohibited in order to maintain their submission. And that's the connective tissue of the text. So you've got this be submissive, be in submission, and then here's two activities that you cannot do so that you can remain in submission. So let them learn in full submission. And what's a piece of this? Not teaching and not exercising authority over men. In other words, you're finding women who are being divisive. You're finding women who are expressing levels of authority over men. Paul says, nope, they have to learn in full submission, and they're not allowed to teach or exercise authority over men. So that's the through line of this passage. Now, there are 6 exegetical issues we have to discuss briefly. The first is the word permit. I do not permit. So some say or claim that this makes the following restriction, that women can't teach or have authority over men, limited and temporary. That nothing definite, however, can be concluded from this word. The word's in present tense, so yes, it does make it reflective of the time of Paul's writing, but it's not correct to say that just because it's in present tense, that shows the command is temporary. The other option would be that the command is a general command, and Paul is exercising the authority of this command in that moment. There's also the meaning of the word teach. Well, what is Paul actually prohibiting? Well, teach in the New Testament is used to denote the careful transmission of tradition concerning Jesus Christ and the authoritative proclamation of God's will to believers in light of that tradition. And so in the pastoral epistles, teaching has this restricted sense of authoritative doctrinal instruction always. Scripture is going to replace the apostles in time, not the teachers. And so the office of teaching is still in place. But the teaching prohibited here would be that which we would call preaching and the teaching of Bible and doctrine in the church, also in colleges and also in seminaries. There's much more leeway in terms of Bible studies and things like that. Those wouldn't be official teaching over the entire church. And obviously you could have women leading Bible studies of women. But again, the key things that are being restricted would be things, at least in the modern day, we would say preaching, teaching of the Bible and doctrine in church, colleges, and seminaries. So is every kind of teaching prohibited or only teaching of men? Well, no, he allows women to teach other women, like in Titus 2, 3 through 4. The meaning, secondarily, what's the meaning to have authority? Well, there's a frequent appeal, unfortunately, to the etymology of the word, but that's dangerous. And I actually I caution people not to look at the etymology of the word because often it can mislead you. For example, things like butterfly. Well, butter and fly have nothing to do with the actual insect that is a butterfly, yet the etymology of the two words or the roots are very, very different. So I always exercise caution in that area. And essentially, the occurrences of the word and verb are closest in time and nature to 1 Timothy and what it means to have authority or dominate or to have dominion over, not in a negative way of lording it over someone. And so Paul's three uses of the word fit with the translation of to have authority over. And essentially, this would disbar a woman or debar a woman from serving in any role that is elder equivalent, as that's the position of authority over men, which is why there's a prohibition against teaching, because the elder role was a teaching role. Elders and pastors were teachers and overseers of the church. That's why women weren't allowed to be elders and teachers. But again, this only applies to activities within the Christian communities, so we have to use it only in the sense in which it is appropriate to use it. A fifth question is, are teaching and having authority two activities or one? Well, some would say, well, teaching and have authority are really just the same thing. Well, no, the two activities are treated separately elsewhere, and thus they are closely related, but they are indeed distinct. And finally, are there only husbands and wives in view? Well, again, the wording and context both favor the broader reference. The grammar is general in its context. It does not seem to be referring to husbands and wives only. So let's move on to then the basis of this instruction, which is creation and the fall in verses 13 and 14. So we want to ask the question, does this apply today? We cannot automatically say it does. We can't just jump to a conclusion and say that it automatically applies. Forms of greeting, greet each other with a holy kiss. Does that apply to today? But it's also not a matter of identifying a local or temporary circumstance and then concluding based on that a limited application. In other words, we can't simply say, oh, because we can identify the reason that Paul said this, that means it's not applicable. Well, no, it could be just as applicable, that's the reason Paul chose to mention it. So we have to identify the circumstances that might limit its application to certain times and places. And many people think they can do this. Some people say that Paul is addressing only women who have succumbed to the false teachings at Ephesus. So they're going to link this again to Ephesus, and they're going to claim that the whole of 1 Timothy is dominated by false teaching. I would say that's exaggerated. I think there's other things going on as well. People are also going to argue that the reference to Eve means Paul's only talking about deceived women. But again, there's no evidence in the text for that. The general subordination or insubordination seems a better fit. It also ignores the created order as its primary focus in verse 13. It talks about God creating Adam and Eve, and that's the focus. Again, the principle also can't be separated from the behavior, as it can in the situation of head coverings. So, for example, in head coverings, a head covering does not universally mean submission. It did in that culture. So if it ceased to mean submission, if it ceased to be an appropriate thing for submission, it would cease to be a requirement. However, teaching and having authority over men is not something that can be separated out. Teaching means to have authority over in some sense, and having authority over is to upstart the created order. So for women to have it over men. So you can't separate this out like you could, for example, in the case of head coverings or greet with the holy kiss. Now, a second comment is that Paul is only requiring conformity to existing cultural conceptions of the women's role, given that false teachers are promoting women teachers. So the problem is it's not teaching that's the issue. It's actually submission. So if it were just false teaching, if the whole point of this verse would say, well, women are teaching things falsely, therefore they have to stop teaching, could that be well and good? The problem is that's not it. It's submission. Paul directs this back to submission, which is related to the created order, and says that's why he doesn't let women teach or have authority over men. And so we can see then that, yes, indeed, this actually is something for all time, that this is rooted in the created order. It's rooted in the general submission of women to men. And we're seeing this play out, that it's not specifically just a cultural thing, even though it is happening. The problem is occurring because of false teaching at the time. And then we see a women's role in the positive light in verse 15. And interestingly enough, there's two different ways to interpret this verse. One is that women will be kept safe during childbirth. That's one way people have interpreted it. There's also a way of interpreting it that says, actually there's a couple ways, that say that women will literally be saved through childbirth. Elsewhere, though, sozo always refers to salvation. It's a bizarre reference. But I actually think, and many commentators do as well, that this is actually a reference to the Messiah. That the idea of women will be saved through childbirth is the idea that as the curse came upon Eve, because remember, it's directly related to Eve right before it. So the birth of the seed will save. In other words, the seed that comes through women will save. And so there's a comment, but women will be saved through childbirth. There's an interesting reference back to the Messiah. And this might have been against a false teaching that women should abandon the home. Now, there's another aspect of this too, in terms of childbirth and things of that nature, where, remember, people were being encouraged not to get married, not to have children, to abandon the family. And yet, by going with the family, having children, doing the roles God has intended, there is an aspect of salvation in terms of security in God's protection and provision. In other words, leaving that can actually put one in a very precarious situation. So there's a number of different ways people have tried to interpret that verse. I think there's a couple that are better than others. I think the messianic aspect is actually really cool. I think as well that breakdown of society could be in light, because that's what would have happened. Had the Christian church basically gotten rid of marriage and gotten rid of sex and gotten rid of children, it would have gone the way of something like Jainism, which essentially destroyed itself because there was no people having babies. There's no kids. So it's like it basically kind of dies out because there's no reproduction of it. And so we see this here in these verses. So there's a couple possibilities for those verses. And so in conclusion, I guess I'd just like to reiterate. Yes, I think these verses do teach that women shouldn't teach or have authority over men. This would basically include pastors and elder positions, and it would include officially teaching doctrine at the college, seminary, or church level. But that is a very minor restriction. There's a wide berth and wide opportunities for women to teach others, even in the church context, teaching women and children, co-working in Bible studies, like small groups and things like that. There's a lot of other opportunities as well for women to do that. And again, this is related back to the general teaching of male headship, which we've covered in previous lectures. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and see if there are any questions. And I'm not seeing any questions, so we'll go ahead and cut it there. And I hope you guys join us for next time, where we're going to be continuing our trek through the New Apostolic Reformation. With that, this was Spirit of Truth, Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. What does it mean to not teach or have authority over men? Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.